They changed our faces, but they could never erase who we were.
Brown-skinned working men walked dusty roads with Jesus for 3 years, and every single painting you have ever seen of them is a lie. Not a small lie, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate, centuries-long repaint job that turned a crew of African and Afro-Asiatic laborers into a European fraternity sitting around a banquet table in matching robes. The Last Supper you grew up looking at, that painting is from Italy in the 1490s. Leonardo da Vinci used his friends as models. Not one of those men ever set foot in Galilee. Not one of them spoke a word of Aramaic. Not one of them knew what the disciples actually looked like. And yet, that painting became the picture in every black grandmama's living room from Memphis to Detroit. The real disciples were brown. They were black. They were sun-beaten, callous, working-class men from a colonized country. And the moment you see them the way they actually were, the whole gospel hits different. So sit down, get comfortable, because we are about to give 12 men their faces back. Start with the land. Jesus picked his disciples from a region called Galilee. Galilee was the rough part of the country. The country part, the part the religious elites down in Jerusalem looked down on. It sat in the northern reaches of what we now call Israel, and the people there were farmers, fishermen, day laborers, and tradesmen. Galilee in the first century was a melting pot of Jewish folks, Syrian folks, Phoenician folks, and people who had been moving back and forth across the trade routes between Africa, Arabia, and the Near East for thousands of years. Every one of those populations was dark-skinned, brown to deep brown. We have skeletal remains from that exact region in that exact time period, and the forensic reconstructions all come back the same. The average Galilean man in the first century stood about 5'1", had brown skin, dark curly hair, and dark eyes. 5'1". That is not the tall, flowing figure on the church wall. That is a short, wiry, sun-baked working man. That is what the disciples looked like, every last one of them. Now look at what these men did before Jesus called them. Most of them were fishermen: Peter, Andrew, James, John, probably others. They worked the Sea of Galilee, which is not a sea, it is a lake, hot all day, hot at night. They were out there before sunrise pulling nets, standing in boats with no shade, gutting fish in the sun, mending tackle with their hands. A man who works on that water for 20 years does not have soft pink skin. He has skin like leather, dark, weathered, marked up by salt and sun. His hands are torn up. His shoulders are thick from rowing. His back is bent from hauling nets. That is the body Jesus walked up to and said, "Follow me." He did not call a group of seminary students. He called a crew of working men whose skin had been baked dark by a lifetime of labor. The kind of men you see at any dock, any construction site, any farm in the country, with arms thicker than their necks and faces tough as old shoe leather. Now look at the names. The disciples did not go by Peter and John and Matthew in their own time. Those are European versions of their names that came along centuries later. In real life, Peter was Shimon, which we say is Simon's. His brother was Andreas. James was Yaakov, which we say is Jacob. John was Yochanan. Matthew was Matityahu. Thomas was Tauma, which is an Aramaic word that just means twin. These are Hebrew and Aramaic names from a Semitic people. These are not European names. These are not names from cold countries. These are the names of a brown-skinned people speaking a brown-skinned language in a brown-skinned land. When somebody calls out Yochanan in first century Galilee, 20 men with dark skin and dark beards turn their heads. Not one of them looks like the figure with strawberry blonde hair you've been staring at your whole life. Let us start with Peter, because Peter is the one everybody knows. Peter was loud. Peter was hot-tempered. Peter was the kind of man who pulled out a sword and cut a soldier's ear off when they came for Jesus in the garden. Peter was the kind of man who said the wrong thing at the wrong time and then felt bad about it later. Peter was the kind of man who promised loyalty out loud and then broke down crying when he failed to live up to it. Tell me you do not know a black man like Peter. Tell me you do not have an uncle, a cousin, a daddy, somebody in your family who is just like him. Big heart, quick mouth, hands that work, faith that wavers and comes back stronger. Peter was a fisherman who became the rock the early church was built on. He had a wife. He had a mother-in-law who Jesus healed. He was a family man with calloused hands and a brown face. And when he preached at Pentecost, 3,000 people came to faith in one afternoon. Peter ended up in Rome, where the empire eventually killed him. Tradition says he asked to be crucified upside down because he did not feel worthy to die the same way Jesus did. That is the kind of man Peter was. Then come the other working class boys. Andrew was Peter's brother, quieter, the one who actually brought Peter to Jesus in the first place. Andrew was the connector, the one who introduced folks. He ended up taking the gospel north into what is now Ukraine and Russia. And tradition says he was killed in Greece on an X-shaped cross. Then you got James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Jesus nicknamed those two the sons of thunder because they were rowdy. Once they wanted to call down fire from heaven on a village that did not welcome them, Jesus had to check them. These were not gentle souls. These were hard men. Their daddy, Zebedee, ran a fishing business with hired hands. So they were not the poorest of the poor, but they were still working men with sun-beaten skin and rough hands. James became the first disciple to be killed for his faith, executed by King Herod. John lived the longest of all of them, ended up exiled on a little island called Patmos, and wrote the book of Revelation as an old man with his eyes still sharp enough to see visions. Now look at Matthew. Matthew is interesting because Matthew was a tax collector. In that society, a tax collector was the lowest of the low. He was a Jewish man working for the Roman Empire, collecting money from his own people to send to the occupiers. His own community hated him. They lumped him in with sinners and outsiders. Think about what that means. Matthew was a brown man whose own people would not eat with him because of the work he was doing to survive under occupation. Jesus walked up to his tax booth and said, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and went, left the money on the table, left the booth. And the first thing he did was throw a dinner party at his house and invite all the other outcasts, other tax collectors, other folks the religious crowd would not touch. Matthew knew what it felt like to be looked down on. And the gospel he wrote later on is full of grace for the people everybody else wrote off. Then you got Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot. The Zealots were a political movement. They were the resistance. They wanted to fight Rome with swords. They were the militants of their day, the ones organizing against the empire. So one of Jesus' 12 was a man with revolutionary politics, walking right next to Matthew, the tax collector, who literally worked for that same empire. Jesus put those two men on the same team and told them to figure it out. That is not a small detail. That is the kind of crew Jesus was building. Judas Iscariot is the one everybody knows for the wrong reason. Iscariot might come from a word meaning man from Korioth, a town in the south, which would make Judas the only southern disciple in a group of northerners. He was the outsider. He kept the money bag. And he sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver and could not live with what he did afterward. Even in his betrayal, he was a brown man caught up in something bigger than he could handle. Thomas is the one we call the doubter, but Thomas deserves better than that nickname. Thomas was the one who said, "Let us go and die with him," when Jesus decided to walk into a dangerous town. Thomas was loyal. He just needed to see things with his own eyes before he committed. And here is the part nobody talks about. After the resurrection, Thomas did not stay in the Middle East. Thomas got on the trade routes and walked, sailed, and rode all the way to India. He founded Christian communities along the Malabar coast of southern India that still exist today, almost 2,000 years later. They are called the St. Thomas Christians, and they have an unbroken tradition going back to the disciple himself. Now, think about what that means. For Thomas to walk into India and be received, he had to look like a man who belonged in that part of the world. He was not a strange, pale figure stumbling off a boat. He was a brown-skinned Galilean man walking into another brown-skinned region and finding common ground. That is how the gospel spread so fast in those early years. The men carrying it looked like the people they were preaching to. Philip went to what is now Turkey. Bartholomew went to Armenia and possibly India. James, the son of Alphaeus, went to Syria and Egypt. Jude Thaddeus went to Persia, where he was killed. Every one of these men ended up scattered across Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and the lands east and south of where they started. Not a single one of them went to England. Not a single one of them went to Germany. Not a single one of them went to Scandinavia. The original gospel mission map points south and east into the lands of brown and black people. The disciples spread the faith along the same trade routes their ancestors had been walking for thousands of years. And everywhere they went, they were welcomed by people who recognized them as one of their own. Now let us talk about Mark, because Mark is critical, even though he was not one of the original 12. Mark was a young man who traveled with Peter and Paul and ended up writing one of the 4 Gospels. And after Jesus' resurrection, Mark went to Egypt. He founded the church in Alexandria, which became one of the most important centers of early Christianity in the entire world. The Coptic Christians of Egypt traced their entire faith back to Mark. They have been worshiping continuously for 1900 years. And the Coptic church has always painted Mark as an African man because he lived in Africa, died in Africa, and was buried in Africa. His remains stayed in Alexandria for centuries until Italian merchants stole them in the 800s and took them to Venice. But the Coptic Christians never forgot. They still hold Mark as their founding father, and they have always seen him as one of their own people. So, if you want to know what the disciples looked like, do not look at Da Vinci. Look at Coptic icons. Look at Ethiopian Orthodox paintings. Look at the murals in Nubian churches that got dug up out of the sand in the last 100 years. In every one of those traditions, the disciples are dark-skinned, brown, deep brown, sometimes jet black, curly hair. African features. These are the oldest continuous Christian artistic traditions on the planet, kept alive by churches that never went through the European Renaissance. They were painting the disciples this way in the 300s, the 400s, the 500s, long before any European painter was even born. The original image was preserved in Africa, while Europe was still figuring out how to read and write. So how did the picture change? Same way Mary's picture changed. Same way Jesus' picture changed. The Renaissance hit Italy in the 1400s, and rich families started paying painters to do religious art that looked like them. Da Vinci painted The Last Supper between 1495 and 1498 on the wall of a monastery in Milan. He used local Italian men as his models. The man who modeled for Judas was reportedly a criminal Da Vinci found in the streets. The man who modeled for Jesus was a young Italian singer. Every face in that painting is an Italian face from the 1490s. Not one of them has anything to do with first century Galilee. And yet, that painting became the most reproduced religious image in human history. It is on calendars. It is on coffee mugs. It is on the wall of every grandmama from Cleveland to Charleston. An Italian fantasy from 500 years ago became the official picture of 12 brown men from 2,000 years ago. And most people have never stopped to ask why. Now ask yourself what this means. The men closest to Jesus, the ones who walked with him every day, who ate with him, who slept next to him on cold nights, who saw him pick him up after his death and burial, the men who watched him rise again, those men were not European. They were not pale. They were not soft-handed. They were brown-skinned working men from a small region of the world who looked exactly like the black men sitting in church pews across America every Sunday. The most important spiritual movement in human history was launched by 12 dark-skinned laborers, and the world rewrote their faces to make sure nobody noticed. That is not a coincidence. That is a strategy. And it worked for 500 years until people started digging back into the old paintings and the old manuscripts and the old churches and pulling the truth back into the light. And here is the part that should sit in your spirit. Jesus did not pick scholars. He did not pick priests. He did not pick rich men's sons. He walked past the seminary and went to the docks. He walked past the temple and went to the tax booth. He walked past the political class and went to the fishermen and the day laborers and the men nobody else was looking at. The Son of God built his entire movement out of working class, brown men with rough hands and short tempers and real lives. Men who had families to feed. Men who had bills coming due. Men who had been overlooked their whole lives. And he told those men they were going to change the world. And they did. 12 regular brown men from a country town in an occupied land turned the entire world upside down within 3 generations. By the year 300, the Roman Empire that killed Jesus had bent the knee to the faith those 12 men spread. That is what working class brown men accomplished with nothing but their feet, their voices, and the truth they carried. Now look at how they died, because the way these men died tells you everything about who they really were. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece. James, the brother of John, was beheaded by King Herod, the first of the 12 to be killed. Philip was tortured and crucified in what is now Turkey. Bartholomew was skinned alive and then beheaded in Armenia. Matthew was killed in Ethiopia. You heard me right. Matthew, the tax collector turned gospel writer, took his ministry into the kingdom of Axum, deep in Black Africa, and he was killed there. His body is still in Africa. Thomas was speared to death in India. James, the son of Alphaeus, was beaten to death and then thrown from a temple. Jude Thaddeus was clubbed to death in Persia. Simon the Zealot was sawn in half in Persia. Only John died of old age, and he had been boiled in oil before that and lived through it. These men did not retire. They did not get book deals. They did not move to the suburbs and write memoirs. They got hunted down across 3 continents and killed for refusing to shut up about a brown-skinned carpenter from Nazareth. 11 out of 12 died violent deaths in foreign lands. That is not the resume of soft men. That is the resume of warriors. And every one of those deaths happened in lands populated by brown and black people. Ethiopia, India, Persia, Armenia, Egypt, Greece. None of them died in Paris. None of them died in London. None of them died in any place that looks anything like the paintings on the church wall. They died where the brown people were because they were brown men carrying a message to other brown people, and the empire could not stand the speed at which it was spreading. Now, I want you to think about something. There is a reason the empire that eventually took over Christianity, the Roman Empire under Constantine, started moving the image away from the original. Once Rome made Christianity the state religion in the 300s, they had a problem. They had inherited a faith founded by 12 brown men from a country they had colonized and crucified the leader of. How do you make that faith comfortable for a Roman emperor sitting on a throne in a marble palace? You start changing the pictures. You start moving the centers of power from Jerusalem and Alexandria and Antioch up to Rome and Constantinople. You start translating everything into Latin and Greek and pushing the African and Asian voices to the side. You start commissioning art that makes the Holy Family look like the imperial family. It did not happen overnight. It took centuries. But by the time the Renaissance rolled around 1,000 years later, the picture had been so thoroughly rewritten that 12 brown working men had become 12 Italian gentlemen at a banquet table. But the original picture refused to die completely. It survived in Ethiopia. It survived in Egypt. It survived in the Syriac churches of the Middle East. It survived in the St. Thomas communities of India. These were the parts of the church that empire never fully controlled. And they kept the real picture alive on the walls of their oldest sanctuaries. Walk into an Ethiopian Orthodox church today and look at the painting of the Last Supper on the wall. Every face is black. Every disciple is brown-skinned. The artistic tradition there has never changed because the truth there was never lost. They kept what Europe gave up, and now the rest of us are starting to find our way back to what they preserve. And here is something else that does not get said enough. The disciples were not loners. They had families. Peter had a wife who traveled with him. Several of the other apostles were married. They had children. They had cousins and uncles and grandmothers. The early church was not a club of single men. It was a movement of whole families, and every one of those families was brown. The wives were brown. The children were brown. The grandmothers cooking the meals after meetings were brown. The whole community looked like a black family reunion in Birmingham on a Saturday afternoon. That is the picture of the early church. Not a stained glass window. A family gathering of dark-skinned people praying together, eating together, supporting each other while the empire tried to stomp them out. And when persecution hit hard, those families had to make hard choices, hide the children, move in the middle of the night, worship in caves and basements, bury the dead in secret, keep the faith alive by candlelight, That is how the early church survived 300 years of being hunted. Brown families in dangerous times choosing faith over fear. Tell me that does not sound like the black church in America. Tell me that does not sound like our people during slavery, holding secret prayer meetings in the woods, hush harbors, brush arbors, gathering in the dark to praise a God they were not even supposed to be allowed to worship. The pattern is the same because the people are the same. The early Christian church and the Black American church are not two different things. They are the same river running through different centuries. Now think about what this means for black men in particular. For 400 years in this country, black men have been told they are dangerous, lazy, dumb, unworthy. Every system in America has lined up to tell black men they are not enough. And every picture of holiness has been built around men who look nothing like them. So when a black man walks into a church and sees 12 white faces at the Last Supper, what is the unspoken message? The unspoken message is that holiness is not for him, that the inner circle is not for him, that the men closest to God do not look like him. That is a lie, a deliberate, painted on, framed, and hung in every church lie. The men closest to Jesus were black men, working black men, quick-tempered black men, loyal black men, faithful black men who failed and got up, black men who doubted and came back, black men who carried a movement on their backs and died for it across 3 continents. That is who Jesus picked. That is who he trusted. That is who he built his church on. And every black man watching this right now needs to understand that the original blueprint for following Jesus was a brown-skinned working man with calloused hands and a real life. You do not have to clean yourself up to qualify. You do not have to be educated to qualify. You do not have to be wealthy to qualify. The original 12 had none of that. They had their hands, their feet, their faith, and a willingness to walk. That is all Jesus ever asked for. The picture got changed, but the original blueprint never did. The kind of man Jesus calls is still the same kind of man he called 2,000 years ago. And every black grandmother who has been praying for her grandsons, every black mother who has been worrying about her boys, every black auntie who has been laying hands on the foreheads of nephews who are walking a hard road, all of you should know something. The men Jesus loved most, the men he gave the keys of the kingdom to, the men he trusted with the gospel, those men look like the boys you are praying for. They had the same temper. They had the same hard hands. They had the same family struggles. And Jesus saw something in them worth dying for. He sees the same thing in your boys. The picture on the wall lied to you about what the inner circle looks like. The truth is your sons are walking in the same lineage as Peter and James and John, and there is room for them at that table. So pass this on. Tell the brothers, the cousins, the deacons, the men in your family who have been carrying weight and wondering if they belong. Who tell them they belong. Tell them the original 12 looked just like them. Tell them the gospel was built on the shoulders of brown working men, and the empire spent 500 years trying to make us forget. Show them the Ethiopian icons. Show them the Coptic paintings. Show them the descriptions in the book that always said exactly who these men were. The picture is coming back into focus, one truth at a time. If this opens something up for you, share it with the men who need it most. Drop me a comment and tell me which disciple story hit you the hardest, and stay close, because we have a whole lot more faces to give back to the people they belong to.